Of the hundreds or so paddles that I've tested so far as a paddle reviewer, the Franklin C45 is my clear personal favorite, and it's now my main go-to paddle, which is no small thing considering its competition. We'll talk pros and cons, and we'll get into my very interesting dissection of this paddle, but to be absolutely direct, I think this is one of the best paddles in existence, and I don't foresee that changing anytime soon. It's plusher and more forgiving than a Paddletek, it's markedly quicker in the hand than the new Joola Pro 4s or the carbon true foams, and it's one of the few power paddles with strong pop that I can actually control well. With this channel's PBMED discount code, the price of a C45 comes down to just over $200. This is a price that really makes a paddle have to prove something big in order to justify a recommendation from me. As a comparison, these are the prices of similarly performing power or power-leaning all-court paddles, with the top 6 on this list also having both USAP and UPA tournament approval certifications, which means those paddles can essentially be used at really any tournament you go to. I'll breeze through the basic need-to-know specs before getting a little more into the weeds with the interesting construction stuff and my dissection, followed by actual gameplay performance. Overall, this is a hybrid-shaped paddle with a 14mm thick core and a face that is made up of a triple layer of carbon fiber that's oriented in a 45-degree pattern one from another, which is different than the typical 90-degree orientation that most carbon fiber layering systems use, and it gives this carbon fiber sheet a softer feel that offsets its more narrow 14mm thickness. One thing you should definitely not overlook is the handle on the C45, which is plenty long at roughly 5.5 to 5.7 inches and has a narrow 4.3 inch diameter, which makes this ultralight paddle all the more easy to maneuver around at will, and is very reminiscent of the handle on the highly maneuverable Neonic Flare Prime X, which I selected as the number 2 overall paddle of 2024. Not only does this paddle play very uniquely, but the construction of the C45 uses what I believe to be a first of its kind double thermoforming technique that utilizes multiple steps that I believe are completely new to the world of pickleball, at least to my knowledge. After layering the polypropylene core and the carbon fiber layers together in a large sheet, the materials go through a first round of thermoformed heating, then the paddle shapes are cut out of that larger sheet. They then use a CNC machine to burrow out a groove in the side of the paddle to insert foam layers, and then run the paddle through a second thermoforming process. It may just make the most sense to move right into the dissection portion now, so we can talk about the significance of all this, and then connect it to gameplay, so either be prepared to nerd out with me a little bit or skip forward to that gameplay portion. The face was adhered very tightly, and it actually gave me a hard time trying to get it off, which is always reassuring against future disbonding between the face and the core of the paddle. Once I got it off, I could feel the relative flexibility and significance of the 45-degree orientation of the carbon fiber sheets relative to faces whose carbon fiber layering is at 90-degree orientations, which were slightly more stiff, and then obviously less stiff than those that contain fiberglass. The honeycomb cells looked very orderly and healthy, and looking down from the top, there's no evidence of mushrooming on either side of the cells from being over-compressed at any step of the construction process, like you can see here with the Mod TA15. Next to the honeycomb core is that inner horseshoe layer of EVA foam, and right away a big thing that jumped out to me was not only was this foam layer not adhered to the honeycomb core, which is a good thing, but there's actually quite a bit of free room between the honeycomb cells and the foam. Having paddles where the core adheres to that foam edge creates a potentially large break-in, as the core tends to pop off and separate from that foam beside it, and then when you insert too much foam into the paddle edge during thermoforming and then overheating, it causes lateral pressure on the core cells, which compromises their integrity, and obviously, neither of those things are going to be a problem here. The separation and spatially free core of the C45 probably explains why it feels so much plusher than I expected a 14mm thermoform paddle to feel, and why it makes such an aggressive drum beat type sound when you hit with it. The handle feels very nice, and I actually wasn't sure if it was fully molded or not before unwrapping it. You can see that it actually isn't fully molded into one piece like the handle of the Spartus Orion paddle here, but the way it's encased makes it feel just as good anyway. And like you might expect, you can see that the outer foam edge goes all the way down the paddle handle, providing a little extra strength against breakage you see in some other Gen 1 or narrow handles paddles. For the sake of thoroughness, and perhaps the most important part here, I cut the paddle into cross section to look for signs of a crease in the core that you see with compressed cores that leads to high rates of breakage. And you can pleasantly see here that the columns are upright, they're straight, clean as a blade, and they don't have any creases that would indicate an otherwise compressed core. Overall, this was a very unique dissection for me, and it explains a lot of how the paddle feels and plays. The precision of the CNC cutting and the space between the core and the foam, alongside the flexible face and the thin core, explain the good pop, the plush feel and the lack of significantly hot break-in after a day or so of using this paddle. So far, I've used this paddle every single play session I've had over the past several weeks, and after the first day using it where it got a little more aggressive sounding and absorbent feeling, I haven't noticed any significant break-ins or continued changes to this point. If you take a look at the measurable metrics of these paddles after they're all put together, you'll see that they're incredibly light and maneuverable with a wildly low stock weight, swing weight, and maneuverability score, with low maneuverability scores indicating faster paddles, the feel of which my podcast co-host Brent spoke on in one of our recent episodes, and I'll share that along with several other little gold nuggets he dropped because he was really on a roll that day.
The swing weight is so light. I was way early on like counters and flicks. They'd end up going, typically if you get sped up into the triangle rule is it goes back. Like if I get sped up this way, it goes back that way.
Yeah. It was
they were going
back
they were going behind the person and out because I was so early on it. So I needed to add some weight, especially up in this area to increase the swing weight a good bit.
Combining the quick hand speed and the strong pop of the C45 make it super fun to counter and attack with, but maybe not as fun to be on the receiving end of.
When we were drilling the other day and, you were trying the engage, the mark, you were trying all the paddles that we're talking about pretty much now. This one, the balls came off the hottest. From you to me, I think you bagged me the most, like, you might have bagged me 3 times. At least 2 were from the Franklin.
Is that it? Is that how many times?
I don't know. You may have won the battle, but I won the war most of the time on those.
We're not going to get into that.
But yeah, I would say that was definitely the hardest hitting being across the net from you at the kitchen.
The twist weights are pretty low, and without lead tape, you may see some twisting of the paddle in your hand during games. I'll show my setup, and for your convenience, I'll put the static, swing, and twist weights of the C45 on the screen here with no added weight, 0.5 grams per inch tungsten tape wrapped around the entire paddle face, and 1 gram per inch tungsten tape wrapped around the whole paddle face as well. I ended up preferring the 1 gram per inch setup, mostly because of trial and error, and that's just what felt good to me. This made the sweet spot much bigger and gave the paddle a little more pop, drive speed, and a touch more ball absorption. Measured spin of this paddle was very high, but I think the important correlate and the thing that makes it stand out was its easily maneuverable nature, which made it easy to whip around and shape the ball well from pretty much any position. Pop was strong, but not so strong that I couldn't control it, most likely because of the plush feeling face and the good dwell time.
But as far as like power and pop, it's nice. Like I don't know where you would put it on like a power pop standpoint.
Pop is the
really good.
Here.
Pop is definitely like in that power category of paddles. With a decent amount of weight, I feel like the power is pretty close to the power category. I'd say it's like creeping up on the Paddletek Bantam TKO.
I do agree that the drive speed falls closer to the all-court type range as opposed to the high power range. And once I added the weight around the paddle face, I found that power was plenty high enough for me in games and I wasn't left wanting. It's a little bit hard for me to explain, but like I mentioned before, this is one of the few power paddles I can actually control really well, and it's probably a combination of the softer feeling face and the good dwell time for a 14mm paddle, and the easy maneuverability that make it seem easy to carve up the court. I would say the sweet spot is good, but it's not mind-blowing or anything. It's still a 14mm paddle. There's a hint of flex in the handle when you swing hard, not as much as I've found with some Selkirk paddles or some other Gen 1 paddles, but that's something to be aware of if you don't like that. If I were to pick a paddle that it plays closest to, I'd say it plays a lot like a better, plusher, and more forgiving 12.7mm Paddletek TKO CX, with the main differences being a larger sweet spot on the C45, and that dead spot you experience up towards the top of the paddle face of the TKO is much more forgiving on the C45 by comparison. In terms of a couple more comparisons, the new Joola Pro 4s do have higher drive speeds, and the pop level of the C45 falls just below the 14mm Perseus Pro 4 and just above the 16. But the truly distinguishable factor for the C45 is its high maneuverability and substantially lower price when compared to the Pro 4s. The 11624 power paddles are less expensive and have a more crisp feel to their faces compared to the more plush feel of the face of the C45 that has a little better ball dwell time. Pop is higher on the C45, and again, it is more maneuverable. Even though I haven't experienced any concerning things or large changes with the C45 yet, the big question mark here is durability, since these paddles really are just too new to have proved themselves in that realm yet, so you can be sure I'll provide updates on that in subsequent PBMED podcast episodes. After a healthy dose of skepticism, for me the C45 has proved to be every bit as good as they said it was. It's now my main paddle, and it's become the UPAA approved paddle of choice for both Brent and I for PPA tournaments. All pros already being mentioned, I think the people who may not like this paddle might be folks who need a huge sweet spot, like on wide body shaped paddles, those who are looking for a paddle that is more control oriented, or for people who don't want to add weight to increase performance, because this paddle does benefit from that. And that's my take on the new Franklin C45. I hope the review was helpful. If you haven't hit subscribe already, don't forget to do so, and I'll catch you here for the next one.